Hello, I'm Greenbrier Almond. I'm reading my father's stories of a West Virginia doctor. Dr. Harold David Almond wrote this book as a memoir, and it's divided into 8 parts. I'm now going to read part 7, Honoring Other Doctors. March 30, Doctor's Day. March 30 is Doctor's Day. This is the day observed annually on which we honor members of the medical profession with some act of kindness, gift, or tribute to the untiring devotion doctors demonstrate as they minister to our health and welfare. The red carnation is the symbol of Doctor's Day and was adopted as the official flower in 1929. The analogy of carnation is so closely woven in medical science. It is only fitting that this flower was chosen to honor doctors. Crown coronation denotes honorary distinction. The collar denotes masculinity, love, charity, sacrifice, bravery, and courage. The date March 30 was not chosen at random, but was selected to commemorate one of the greatest discoveries in medical history. It was on March 30, 1842, that 26-year-old Dr. Crawford W. Long, a Georgia physician, first used ether as an anesthetic agent in a surgical operation, thereby providing mankind with the blessedness of freedom from pain and suffering during surgery. Thus did this quiet young country doctor, by this stroke of genius, prove to himself and the world that my profession is to me as ministry from God. Close quotes. Dr. Long died in 1878 at the age of 62, with 40 of his years devoted to the practice of medicine. A statue of Dr. Long is located in the hall leading to the Senate wing of the U.S. Capitol in Washington, D.C. Eudora Brown Almond, no relation to me, is the originator of the idea of Doctor's Day. She was born in the small Georgia village of Fort Lamar, and from early childhood was greatly impressed with the selfless devotion of the medical profession's humanitarian services. In 1920, she married Dr. Charles B. Almond and lived in Winder, Georgia. As she walked through the years beside her husband, sharing the dedication of his life to the practice of medicine, Mrs. Almond became convinced that medicine is the greatest profession on earth. When suggesting that physicians be honored, she originally had in mind only the Winder and Barrow counties in Georgia. After the resolution to pay tribute to the doctors was adopted in the 2 counties, the resolution was presented to the Georgia State Medical Auxiliary, and it was adopted. It was then most appropriate that they chose March 30 as the day for Doctor's Day in honor and pay tribute to the great son of the state of Georgia, Dr. Crawford W. Long, the discoverer of anesthesia. The resolution to honor doctors on March 30 was presented to the Southern Medical Association at their annual meeting held in St. Louis. It was adopted in 1935 and since then has become an integral part of and synonymous with the Southern Medical Association. Now we have Doctor's Day observances in all parts of the country and in foreign countries as well. The Buttonhole Surgeon. 100 years ago, on the 2nd of March, 1869, Dr. John B. Murphy, a red-headed, fiery surgeon in Chicago, did the first appendectomy before the appendix ruptured. Yes, it was customary in that day only to operate after the appendix ruptured. 100 years later, almost to the day, a Buchanan surgeon and a Buchanan urologist made history again by removing an appendix that had not ruptured. Dr. Frank Hartman II and Dr. Peter Ariyama had been referred a 59-year-old man who was difficult to diagnose. It was a puzzle. This man had a misery in his lower right abdomen for several days after lifting a heavy object. He had no loss of appetite, no fever, but he had some blood cells in his urine. On a barium enema X-ray study, he had an irregular mass in his lower right colon. The X-ray specialist thought he might have a tumor. The barium X-ray outlined the junction of the small and large bowel as well as the appendix. The classic symptoms and signs of appendicitis start with misery about the navel, loss of appetite, and then pain migrates to and settles in the right lower abdomen. These were the observations made by Dr. Murphy and on his patient 100 years ago. These clues were not the reason for the operation on Dr. Hartman's patient in 1989. His patient had a hard mass in the right lower abdomen, and this mass was resected and the small 3/4 inch bowel was sutured end to end and to a 1 3/4 inch large bowel. Truth is stranger than fiction. Dr. Murphy not only taught surgeons to operate before the appendix ruptured, but he taught surgeons the world over how to suture intestines end to end in 1892. Dr. Murphy operated on his patient with drip ether. Dr. Hartman had his nurse anesthetist put the patient to sleep with a pentothal sleeping injection, and he used an intravenous dose of muscle relaxant and a narcotic. Dr. Hartman's operating room co-pilots were a competent set of nurses, an RN and an LPN. All anastomoses of the big and small intestines up to 1892 were sutured side to side. Then in 1893, according to Lowell Davis, Dr. Murphy's biographer, and Nancy Reagan's father, Dr. Murphy invented the Murphy button that slipped inside the two open ends of the intestine and allowed the intestinal membrane to be placed in apposition to each other. The button looks like a sleigh bell, and it comes in two pieces. The outer shell fits tightly in the inner tube. Healing takes place without sutures over the button. The two halves of the button are further held together with catgut that lasts about 8 to 10 days before dissolving. In that 8 or 10 days, the cut ends of the intestine heal together. There are small buttons for small bowels for children, and there are larger buttons for the big bowels of adults. All surgeons of the day learned this surgical procedure, which could be done in 15 or 20 minutes, thus saving 60 to 90 minutes of operating time. All the surgeons, including Dr. Murphy, soon realized they could do direct end-to-end anastomoses without buttons. When the pathologist at St. Joseph's Hospital in Buchanan studied the surgical specimen of this 59-year-old patient, this mass was found to be an acute appendicitis invaginated into a larger bowel. Dr. Robert Chamberlain, the attending physician, reported his patient did well and was most happy to find that he had no tumor, but only an acute appendicitis. His patient had feared having a ruptured appendix because his brother had died the year before of an appendicitis abscess and pneumonitis. Every doctor is indebted to his profession. Dr. Hartman is thus thankful to Dr. Murphy for teaching him and all doctors to operate on a non-ruptured inflamed appendix and how to suture intestines end to end. Pause on St. Patrick's Day and think of John B. Murphy. Pause too on Doctor's Day, the 30th of March, and think of some kindness, some sacrifice, some emergency medical services that your doctor provided for you or your family. Thanks for Dr. Jake. In November 1988, Reverend Frank Schaefer, our local United Methodist pastor, wrote an article for Buchanan's The Record Delta newspaper. I wanted to include this article in my book because Reverend Schaefer did such a nice job of paying tribute to my highly respected colleague and my friend, Dr. Jake Huffman. Just the other day, Dr. Almond and I were talking about Dr. Jake Huffman, who is presently a patient at St. Joseph's Hospital after suffering a stroke. Dr. Almond asked me, "Do you know why Jake Huffman is such a great man?" I answered, "Well, I suppose it's because of all the patients he's attended through the years, all the babies he's delivered, all his involvement in our community and with West Virginia University Hospital. Sure, it's all that and one more thing." Doc said, "Jake's a great man because of the city's water tank above the hospital." Then he went on to tell me this story. In 1960, when the new hospital was being constructed, the developers ran into what seemed an insurmountable obstacle. The fire marshal suddenly declared that the 25,000-gallon standby water tank, perfectly adequate for the old Barlow House Hospital, would not have the capacity to serve the new one. Everyone who had anything to do with the building of the hospital, the Catholic nuns, who were the hospital administrators, medical staff, board of directors, architects, and ordinary citizens of Upshur County who had already raised $200,000 were in a state of shock. The West Virginia Board of Health had already approved the hospital plans and made a matching grant. That grant, however, was strictly a one-time thing. In fact, no grant recipient could apply for or secure a second such grant for any unexpected expenditure whatever. The city of Buchanan had only one water tank for the entire community, and the water pressure was very poor on the hospital hill, as well as on Lincoln and Raleigh Heights, Corhart, and the whole west and the end of town. The fire marshal had given a standing order that any time a fire broke out on Hospital Hill, the first truck was sent immediately to the scene. But the second truck was to be dispatched to the fire hydrant at Pinnell and Franklin Street to increase water pressure with its pumps. Many interested groups had met repeatedly to discuss this new crisis regarding the fire marshal's notice that the old tank was inadequate. Even the city council met, but no helpful decisions were forthcoming. There simply was no additional money because resources had been strained to the limit already. At this dark hour, Jake Huffman was called upon to be the man who stands in the gap. He didn't volunteer for the assignment, which might more properly have been the responsibility of the architects. The hospital administrator and others asked Jake in a prayerful way to make a trip to Charleston to seek the apparently impossible, to get more money from the State Board of Health. Jake needed someone to keep him company on the way to Charleston, so his friend and longtime colleague, Dr. Almond, went along for the ride. All the way down along curvy highways that one had to drive before Interstate 79, Jake talked of many things, chatting about this and that, but not once did he talk about the coming meeting or what he would say. Dr. Almond remembers that while Jake talked, his own mouth was dry with anxiety and anticipation. That night he could hardly eat or sleep, and sleep didn't come until late that night in the old Daniel Boone Hotel. The following morning, the two good doctors shared breakfast with a woman who was a member of the Board of Health, but she gave no encouragement at all. At the formal hearing later that day, reactions were mixed, but the board listened to Jake and his silent partner with courtesy. Jake argued, "We just can't plan a hospital construction under these inconsistent rulings. The fire marshal has changed his requirements long after his original ruling had been announced and accepted." Jake noticed that one of the doctors on the board of a physician from Bluefield was nodding his head in agreement, but the chair of the board, who had a great deal of influence, was firmly against any reversal of the ruling. Nevertheless, Jake was elated and talkative as the two doctors made their return trip up the Elk River that evening. though his silent partner was even more silent. The result? The State Board of Health reversed itself and awarded St. Joseph's Hospital an additional $62,500. The city of Buchanan agreed to secure the same amount, and the land was donated by the Edmonston and Iden families. Dr. Almond says, "Some call it the hospital water tank, but that's a misnomer. It should respectfully be called Huffman's water tank." Jake earned that respect because he convinced the Board of Health to reverse itself, which allowed construction of the new hospital in Buchanan to move forward. He even went on to be the city and county health officer for 24 years. Tributes to Dr. Chamberlain. Dr. Robert Lukehart Chamberlain retired from delivering babies in Upshur County and at St. Joseph's Hospital in December 1988. Dr. Bob, as he is known to the hospital and loved by his maternity patients, was delivered by Dr. Lukehart in Marshall County. Appropriately, Lukehart forceps is the type that both Dr. Bob preferred to use in difficult deliveries. In another twist of names, it was to be noted that the first forceps ever made in the 1600s were called Chamberlain forceps, named for their inventor, Dr. Chamberlain. No one can argue that Dr. Robert Lukehart Chamberlain, whose first love is obstetrics, has a name that is well suited. Dr. Chamberlain was feted on December 18 by a large group of 70 people representing the medical staff, administration, family, nurses, aides, and other hospital personnel. Dr. Chamberlain recalled that one time Sister Heriberta told him after a delivery of a boy that he need not circumcise the baby, that St. Peter had already done it. Sure enough, that infant boy didn't need circumcision. A hospital RN recalled a delivery that needs to be retold. Dr. Chamberlain saw a Gravida II, a lady with one child, who came to the emergency room complaining of appendicitis pain for 24 hours. She said the pain rolled around her entire abdomen. Shortly after admission, Dr. Chamberlain delivered a baby, and the appendicitis was cured. The husband could hardly believe Dr. Chamberlain's congratulations. Dr. Jake Huffman welcomed Dr. Chamberlain to Buchanan in 1949, and he was most generous in helping the young doctor build up an obstetrical practice. He delivered about 365 babies per year in that period, which were way too many for one doctor. Even after Dr. Bob retired from his obstetrics practice in 1988, he remained active in his office and hospital and college practice for several more years. On April 15, 1989, at the annual medical meeting of the American Academy of Family Physicians of West Virginia, Dr. Robert Chamberlain received the prestigious award, Mr. Doc. This is a very special award given by his peers to a West Virginia physician for being an outstanding doctor and for involvement in community affairs. Dr. Chamberlain had been a family physician in Buchanan on the staff at St. Joseph's Hospital since August 1949. He had been the West Virginia Wesleyan student, clinic physician, and sports physician since 1949. And in his busy practice, he delivered over 2,400 babies, including 27 sets of twins. He was a member of the Upshur County Board of Education for over 30 years, a member of the First United Methodist Church Choir for 40 years, a participant in local plays and musicals from college days, and an avid golfer when he found the time. Dr. Chamberlain graduated from West Virginia Wesleyan College in 1942 and attended West Virginia University Medical School for 2 years, graduating from Richmond Medical School in 1945. He served 2 years in the U.S. Navy from 1945 to 1947. He is married and the father of 5 children. If a West Virginia mountaineer calls a physician doctor, he is showing respect. If he calls him Mr. Doc, he is showing respect and love, a deserving tribute to Dr. Robert Chamberlain. And this completes Part 7.